Why it sucked to be a horse in the Roman Empire. Hello, and welcome to Sleepy History. Have you ever found yourself staring at a magnificent equestrian statue, a powerful horse frozen in mid-stride with a Roman emperor astride its back, and thought, "That horse looks so noble, so happy"? Tonight, we're going to gently peel back the layers of that majestic image and uncover a much harsher reality. We're going to explore why, for the vast majority of equines, it truly sucked to be a horse in the Roman Empire. But before we journey back in time, a quick question for you. As you're settling in, getting comfortable, what time is it in your part of the world? Go ahead and leave a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our listeners are drifting off from. Now, find your favorite position. Let your head sink deeply into your pillow. Feel the weight of your body being fully supported by the surface beneath you. Take a slow, deep breath in, and as you exhale, release all the tension from your day. Let go of any lingering thoughts or worries. They can wait until morning. For now, there is only the sound of my voice and the steady, rhythmic pace of our story. Allow the gentle cadence of history to be your guide into a deep and restful sleep. There's no need to follow every detail, no need to remember any names or dates. Just let the words wash over you, a soothing current carrying you towards slumber. Tonight, we journey to ancient Rome. Not to the grand palaces or the thundering Colosseum, but to the stables, the dusty roads, and the blood-soaked battlefields. Tonight, we listen to the silent story of the Roman horse. Chapter 1. The Backbone of the Empire. Our story begins not with a single horse, but with the idea of the horse in the Roman mind. To the Romans, the horse was not a pet, not a companion in the way we might think of one today. It was a tool, a machine made of flesh and bone, a vital cog in the immense and intricate machinery of the empire. The Roman world, as it expanded from a single city to a dominion stretching from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia, was built on the back of the horse. Without it, the legions would have marched at a snail's pace, the grain shipments would have rotted in the fields, and the messages of emperors would have been lost to the winds. The sheer number of horses required to keep this vast empire functioning is staggering to contemplate. Every legion had its cavalry wing, the alle, comprised of hundreds of skilled riders on trained war horses. These were the eyes and ears of the army, the swift and deadly predators of the ancient battlefield. Then there were the baggage trains, a sprawling, chaotic procession of mules, donkeys, and sturdy pack horses that followed the legions, carrying everything from tents and cooking pots to siege engines and the soldiers' pay. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal service, relied on a network of relay stations, each with a fresh team of horses ready to carry urgent dispatches at breakneck speed across the continent. In the cities, horses pulled the carts of merchants, the carriages of the wealthy, and the grim wagons that carried away the dead. In the countryside, they were yoked to plows, turning the soil that fed the empire's teeming millions. Even in the realm of entertainment, the horse was a central figure, its thundering hooves the soundtrack to the thrilling and deadly chariot races of the Circus Maximus. The Romans were not sentimental about their horses, but they were practical. They understood the importance of breeding the right horse for the right job. They were, in a sense, the world's first industrial-scale horse breeders. From the swift and agile Numidian horses of North Africa, prized for their speed and endurance, to the massive, powerful horses of Gaul and Germania, bred for their strength in pulling heavy loads, the Romans sought out and cultivated the specific traits they needed. A horse destined for the cavalry would be selected for its courage, its responsiveness to commands, and its ability to withstand the chaos of battle. A chariot horse, on the other hand, would be bred for pure, unadulterated speed, a living projectile launched onto the sandy track of the circus. The common workhorse, the unsung hero of the Roman economy, was bred for its stamina and its placid temperament, its ability to toil for long hours without complaint.
Chapter 2. The Warhorse. Now, let us turn our attention to the most celebrated and perhaps the most brutalized of all Roman horses, the warhorse. Imagine a young stallion, strong and proud, taken from its herd and thrust into a world of iron, leather, and relentless discipline. The life of a Roman cavalry horse was a life of constant preparation for the savage symphony of war. The training was intense, designed to strip away the horse's natural instincts and replace them with unthinking obedience. It would be taught to ignore the clang of steel, the roar of 1,000 shouting men, and the terrifying sight of a charging enemy. It would learn to respond to the slightest pressure of its rider's knees, to wheel and charge and retreat in perfect unison with the rest of the squadron. This was not a gentle process. It was a breaking of the spirit, a reforging of the animal's will to suit the needs of the Roman war machine. The bond between a Roman cavalryman and his horse was a complex one. It was a relationship born of necessity, a partnership forged in the crucible of shared danger. The rider depended on his mount for his speed, his mobility, and in many cases, his very life. A stumble at the wrong moment, a moment of panic in the heat of battle, could mean death for both horse and rider. As such, a cavalryman would take meticulous care of his horse, grooming it, feeding it the best rations, and tending to its every need. But this was not a relationship of equals. The horse was still a weapon, a living extension of its rider's will, and in the brutal calculus of war, it was an expendable weapon. The reality of the ancient battlefield was a hellscape of noise, confusion, and unimaginable violence. For a prey animal like a horse, it was a waking nightmare. The air would be thick with the dust of marching feet, the smell of sweat and blood, and the deafening cacophony of trumpets, war cries, and the screams of the wounded. The ground would be littered with the bodies of the dead and dying, a treacherous landscape of fallen men and horses. In this chaotic environment, the Roman war horse was expected to charge headlong into a bristling wall of enemy spears, to trample underfoot men who were trying to kill it, and to stand its ground in the face of terrifying sights and sounds that would send any normal animal fleeing in terror. The wounds a warhorse could suffer were horrific. Spear thrusts, sword cuts, and arrow wounds were commonplace. A horse that went down in a charge was likely to be trampled by the horses behind it, its body a broken and mangled wreck. Even a minor injury, a sprained leg or a deep cut, could be a death sentence. In the field, there was little time for veterinary care. A horse that could no longer keep up with the legion was a liability. More often than not, it would be dispatched with a quick thrust of a sword, its suffering brought to an end on the side of a dusty road far from home. The mortality rate for cavalry horses was incredibly high. For every glorious statue of a triumphant general on his noble steed, there were 1,000 unnamed horses that had perished in agony and fear on some forgotten battlefield. They died for the glory of Rome, but their sacrifice was rarely acknowledged, their suffering largely unrecorded. They were the silent, four-legged legionaries, the forgotten casualties in the empire's long and bloody history of conquest. And for them, there were no victory parades, no triumphal arches, only the cold, hard earth of a foreign land. Chapter 3. The Circus Maximus. From the grim reality of the battlefield, we now travel to the heart of Rome itself, to the magnificent and terrible spectacle of the Circus Maximus. Here, in this vast, sprawling arena, another kind of horse was pushed to the absolute limits of its endurance, all for the entertainment of the roaring crowds. This was the world of the chariot racer, a world of glamour, fame, and unimaginable danger. The life of a chariot horse was a strange paradox. On one hand, they were the superstars of their day, celebrated and adored by the public. The names of famous horses were known throughout the city. Their victories and defeats were discussed in every tavern and marketplace. A successful chariot team could make its owner fabulously wealthy, and the horses themselves were a symbol of this wealth and success. But behind this glittering facade was a much darker reality. The horses that pulled the chariots in the Circus Maximus were bred for a single purpose: speed. They were the thoroughbreds of the ancient world, sleek, powerful animals with a fiery spirit and a relentless will to win. Their training was every bit as rigorous as that of a warhorse, but it was focused on a different set of skills. They were taught to run as a team, to respond to the slightest command of the charioteer, and to navigate the tight, treacherous turns of the track at flat-out gallop. The pressure on these animals was immense. A single race consisted of 7 grueling laps, a distance of several miles, run at a flat-out gallop. The horses would be lathered in sweat, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming in protest, but still they would be urged on by the whip of the charioteer. The races themselves were a brutal and often deadly affair. The track was a chaotic maelstrom of thundering hooves, spinning wheels, and desperate men and horses. Collisions were frequent, and the results were catastrophic. A chariot that crashed would be smashed to pieces, its driver thrown to the ground to be trampled by the other teams. The horses, tangled in their harnesses, would be dragged along the track, their bodies battered and broken. The central barrier of the track, the spina, was a particularly dangerous spot. Charioteers would jockey for position, trying to cut each other off, and a miscalculation could lead to a horrific pile-up. The crowds would roar their approval at these moments of high drama, their bloodlust stirred by the sight of shattered chariots and broken bodies. For the horses, the Circus Maximus was a place of constant stress
and terror. The roar of the crowd, the crack of the whip, the ever-present danger of a fatal crash. It was a world far removed from the open fields and gentle pastures that were their natural habitat. Even a successful chariot horse had a short and brutal career. The physical toll of the races was enormous, and many horses broke down from the strain. An injury that would be a minor inconvenience for a modern racehorse was a death sentence for a Roman chariot racer. There were no advanced veterinary techniques, no comfortable retirement farms for these equine athletes. A horse that could no longer race was worthless. Its brief moment of glory was over, and it would be sold off for a pittance, its ultimate fate a grim and unhappy one. The adoring crowds that had once cheered its name would quickly forget it, their attention turned to the next rising star. This was the cruel bargain of the Circus Maximus. The price of fame was a life of fear, pain, and a constant looming threat of a violent and public death. The cheers of the crowds were for the horses, the soundtrack to their own destruction.
Chapter 4: The Endless Roads. Let us now leave the roar of the circus and the clang of the battlefield, and turn our attention to the silent, unending toil of the transport horse. These were the humble, unglamorous workhorses of the Roman Empire, the equine equivalents of the modern-day truck driver. Their lives were not marked by moments of high drama or glorious victory, but by a slow, grinding, and relentless routine of hard labor. They were the lifeblood of the Roman economy, the power that moved goods and people across the vast expanse of the empire. But their service was a thankless one, their lives a testament to the Roman genius for organization and their equally profound indifference to the suffering of the animals that served them. The Romans were master road builders, and their network of paved highways was one of the great engineering marvels of the ancient world. But for the horses that traveled these roads, they were not a source of pride, but a scene of endless drudgery. Day after day they would be yoked to heavy carts, laden with everything from grain and wine to building materials and military supplies. They would plod along at a steady, unchanging pace, their hooves striking the hard stone of the road with a monotonous rhythm. The journeys were long, often covering hundreds of miles. The horses would endure blazing summer heat and biting winter cold, their only shelter a makeshift stable at a roadside inn. The physical strain of this constant labor was immense. The carts were heavy, the loads often pushed to the absolute limit of what the horses could pull. The roads, while well built, were not always easy to travel. They wound their way through steep mountain passes and across arid, waterless plains. A horse that stumbled and fell could easily break a leg, a fatal injury in a world without modern veterinary care. The harnesses used by the Romans were often poorly designed, chafing the horse's skin and causing painful sores. The food they were given was often of poor quality, just enough to keep them going, but not enough to truly thrive. They were, in essence, disposable assets, worked until they could work no more, and then replaced. The life of a transport horse was a life of constant discomfort and exhaustion. There were no days off, no leisurely grazing in green pastures. There was only the endless road, the heavy load, and the crack of the driver's whip. The drivers themselves were often as rough and unfeeling as the lives they led. They saw the horses as nothing more than a means to an end, a source of power to be exploited. A horse that was slow or uncooperative would be met with a rain of blows, its spirit crushed by a relentless campaign of casual cruelty. There was no one to speak for these animals, no one to protest their mistreatment. They were simply part of the background noise of the empire, their patient suffering an invisible thread in the grand tapestry of Roman commerce. And what happened when a transport horse finally gave out, its body broken by years of relentless toil? There was no gentle retirement. It would be sold for a pittance to the knackers, its hide used for leather, its flesh perhaps even sold as cheap meat. Its life of service would end in a squalid and unceremonious death, its memory quickly forgotten. These were the horses that built the Roman Empire, the unsung heroes who carried its burdens on their strong and patient backs. Their reward was a life of hardship and a death of utter indifference. The great Roman roads, which stand to this day as a monument to the empire's power and ambition, were paved with the silent suffering of 1,000,000 forgotten horses. Chapter 5. In the Fields and the Mines. Beyond the cities and the great military highways, in the vast agricultural heartland of the empire, another class of horse endured a life of grueling, back-breaking labor. These were the farm horses, the living tractors of the ancient world. Their lives were tied to the rhythm of the seasons, a relentless cycle of plowing, planting, and harvesting. From sunrise to sunset, they would be yoked to heavy wooden plows, their powerful muscles straining to turn the dense, unforgiving soil. The work was slow, repetitive, and utterly exhausting. The sun would beat down on their backs in the summer, the cold wind would whip around them in the winter, but still they would plod on, their heads bowed, their spirits dulled by the sheer monotony of their existence. The Roman farmer, like the Roman soldier and the Roman merchant, was a pragmatist. He saw his horse not as a fellow creature, but as a piece of agricultural equipment. He would feed it and water it, for a starving horse could not pull a plow. But he would also work it to the very edge of its physical limits. The goal was to extract the maximum amount of labor for the minimum amount of investment. A lame horse, a sick horse, an old horse, these were all liabilities, drains on the farm's meager resources. There was little room for sentiment in the hard-scrabble world of Roman agriculture. A horse that could no longer earn its keep was a horse that had outlived its usefulness. But as hard as the life of a farm horse was, there was an even grimmer fate awaiting some of their kind. In the dark and dangerous world of Roman mining, horses were used for some of the most brutal and soul-crushing labor imaginable. They would be sent down into the depths of the earth, into cramped, airless tunnels, where they would spend their lives in perpetual darkness. Their job was to turn the heavy wheels that powered the drainage systems, keeping the mines from flooding. Round and round they would walk, in an endless, meaningless circle, their world reduced to the narrow confines of their subterranean prison. They would never see the sun again, never feel the grass beneath their feet. Their lives were a living entombment, a slow and miserable descent into blindness and despair. The conditions in the mines were appalling. The air was thick with dust and fumes. The noise of hammers and chisels was deafening, and the danger of a cave-in was ever present. The horses would suffer from respiratory diseases, their eyes would be damaged by the constant darkness, and their bodies would be worn down by the relentless, repetitive nature of their work. They were, in a very real sense, being sacrificed for the empire's insatiable demand for precious metals. The gold and silver that adorned the homes of the wealthy and paid the wages of the legions was extracted from the earth at a terrible cost. A cost paid not just by the human slaves who toiled in the mines, but also by the horses that shared their miserable fate. The expectation life of a mining horse was tragically short. Their bodies simply could not withstand the horrific conditions for long. When they finally collapsed from exhaustion or disease, their carcasses would be unceremoniously dragged out of the way, and a new, healthy horse would be brought down to take their place. There was no thought given to their suffering, no recognition of their sacrifice. They were just another resource to be consumed, another tool to be used up and discarded. These were the horses that built the Roman Empire, the unsung heroes who carried its burdens on their strong and patient backs. Their reward was a life of hardship and a death of utter indifference.
Chapter 8. The End of the Road. What happened to a Roman horse when its strength began to fail? When its legs grew weak and its spirit was finally broken by years of relentless toil? In our modern world, we have the concept of retirement, a time for a faithful animal to live out its final years in peace and comfort. For the Roman horse, there was no such gentle end. The end of its useful life was, in most cases, the end of its life altogether. The Roman world was a practical, unsentimental place, and there was no room in it for an animal that could no longer earn its keep. A horse that became too old, too lame, or too sick to work was a liability. It still needed to be fed and sheltered, but it produced nothing in return. For its owner, it was a drain on resources, a mouth to feed that offered no profit. The bond between a Roman and his horse was, for the most part, a commercial one. When the horse ceased to be a valuable asset, that bond was broken. The animal's fate was then sealed by a simple and brutal economic calculation. For many horses, the end of the road led to the knacker's yard. Here, in these grim and squalid establishments, the animal's life would be brought to a swift and unceremonious end. But its usefulness was not yet over. The Romans were masters of recycling, and they wasted nothing. The horse's hide would be stripped and tanned, turned into leather for shoes, belts, and military equipment. Its bones would be boiled down to make glue, its hooves used to make gelatin. Even its flesh might find a use, sold as cheap meat to the poorest segments of the population, or used as feed for other animals. The horse, which had given its life in the service of the empire, would be dismembered and consumed, its body reduced to a collection of useful raw materials. Some horses might escape this fate only to meet an even crueler one. An owner who did not want to go to the trouble of taking his horse to the knacker might simply abandon it, turning it loose on a barren piece of land to fend for itself. For a domesticated animal, unused to foraging for its own food and unable to defend itself against predators, this was a slow and agonizing death sentence. The horse would wander, growing weaker and weaker from starvation, until it finally collapsed and died, its body left to be picked clean by scavengers. This was the ultimate betrayal, the final act of indifference in a life that had been defined by it. There were, as always, exceptions. A wealthy Roman might keep a favorite riding horse or a celebrated chariot racer as a pensioner, allowing it to live out its days in a comfortable stable. But this was a rare luxury, an act of sentimentality that most Romans could not afford and would not have understood. For the vast majority of horses, the end of work meant the end of life. There was no gratitude for their years of faithful service, no recognition of the debt that was owed to them. They were simply used up, worn out, and then discarded, their memory fading as quickly as the sound of their hooves on the stone-paved roads of the empire. The Roman world was a world of constant motion, of relentless progress, and it had little time for those who could no longer keep up the pace. For the Roman horse, the road of life was a one-way street, and at its end there was only the cold, final darkness of the abattoir. Chapter 9. A Glimmer of Hope. In the midst of this bleak and often brutal landscape, it is important to remember that the Roman world was not a monolith. It was a complex and varied society, and just as there was cruelty and indifference, there were also moments of compassion and glimmers of a more enlightened view of the relationship between humans and animals. These glimmers of hope were small and infrequent, but they are there, scattered throughout the historical record, offering a brief respite from the otherwise grim story of the Roman horse. One of the most touching sources of this hope comes from the most unlikely of places, the tombstones of animals. All across the Roman Empire, archaeologists have found epitaphs dedicated to beloved horses, dogs, and other pets. These are not the grand public monuments of emperors and generals, but small, personal expressions of grief and affection. A Roman cavalryman might erect a simple stone for the horse that had carried him safely through a dozen battles, its inscription praising its courage and loyalty. A young girl might mourn the loss of a pet pony, her words a simple and heartfelt expression of a child's love. These small monuments are a powerful reminder that even in a society that viewed animals as property, the bond between a human and a particular animal could be deep and genuine. They show us that some Romans, at least, were capable of seeing their horses not just as tools, but as individuals, as companions, as friends. We also find this more compassionate view in the writings of some Roman philosophers and poets. The philosopher Seneca, for example, argued against the cruelty of the gladiatorial games and spoke of the importance of kindness to all living creatures. The poet Virgil, in his great work The Georgics, writes with a farmer's deep and practical affection for his livestock, urging his readers to treat their animals with care and respect. The historian Plutarch wrote an entire essay on the intelligence and sensitivity of animals, arguing that they were capable of reason and emotion. These were minority voices, to be sure. Their views were not shared by the majority of Romans, but they show that the idea of animal welfare, the concept that we have a moral obligation to treat animals with kindness, was not entirely absent from the Roman world. These writers were planting the seeds of a more compassionate worldview, seeds that would take many centuries to fully blossom, but which were, nonetheless, being sown. Even in the brutal world of the army, there were signs of a practical, if not sentimental, concern for the welfare of horses. The Roman army understood that a healthy, well-cared-for horse was a more effective weapon of war. The De Re Militari, the Roman military manual, contains detailed instructions on the proper care and feeding of cavalry horses. There were specialized grooms, known as hippocampi, whose job it was to look after the animals. The army built solid, well-ventilated stables, and it ensured that its horses received a steady supply of good quality fodder. This was not kindness for kindness' sake. It was a pragmatic and self-interested policy, but for the horses, the motivation did not matter. The result was a life that was, in many ways, better than that of their civilian counterparts. These glimmers of hope do not change the fundamental reality that for most horses, life in the Roman Empire was a hard and often miserable existence. But they do complicate the picture. They show us that the Roman attitude towards animals was not uniformly cruel. They remind us that human nature is complex, and that even in the harshest of societies, there is always room for kindness, for compassion, for the simple and powerful bond that can form between a person and an animal. These small acts of love and respect, these quiet voices of conscience, were a testament to the fact that, even in the shadow of the Colosseum and on the bloody battlefields of the frontier, some Romans at least understood the debt they owed to the silent four-legged partners who helped them build their world. Chapter 10. The Legacy of the Roman Horse. As our journey through the world of the Roman horse comes to a close, and as you feel yourself drifting ever deeper into a state of peaceful relaxation, let us take a moment to reflect on the lasting legacy of these hard-working animals. The empire may have fallen centuries ago, but the impact of its relationship with the horse can still be felt today. The story of the Roman horse is not just a tale of suffering. It is also a story of a profound and world-changing partnership. A partnership that laid the groundwork for much of what was to come in the centuries that followed. The Romans, with their characteristic focus on practicality and efficiency, were masters of selective breeding. They took the raw material of the horses they encountered in their conquests and refined it, creating specialized breeds for specific tasks. The powerful draft horses that would later carry armored knights into battle had their origins in the heavy horses of Gaul and Germania, which the Romans prized for their ability to pull heavy wagons. The swift and agile riding horses that would become the mounts of medieval lords and ladies were descended from the Numidian and Iberian horses that the Roman cavalry used to such great effect. In this sense, many of the modern...
Chapter 11. The Mare and the Foal. In our story so far, we have spoken largely of the stallion, the gelding, the powerful male horse whose strength was so brutally exploited on the battlefield and in the circus. But what of the mares? What of the mothers who brought forth these generations of equine servants? Their story is a quieter one, but no less steeped in hardship. The life of a broodmare in the Roman Empire was a cycle of production, a biological process managed with the same cold pragmatism as the harvesting of a field of wheat. She was not seen as a mother, but as a vessel, a means of creating new tools for the imperial machine. The great breeding farms established by the state or by wealthy landowners were highly organized operations. Stallions were selected for their speed, their strength, or their temperament, their genetic material a valuable commodity.
Mares were chosen for their ability to produce strong, healthy offspring. There was no romance in this pairing, no consideration for the natural rhythms of the animals. It was a calculated commercial transaction. A mare's worth was measured in the number and quality of the foals she could produce. When her fertility declined, when she could no longer create new life, her value plummeted, and her own life was often forfeit. For the mare, pregnancy was not a time of rest or special care. In many cases, particularly on smaller farms or in less wealthy households, a pregnant mare would be expected to continue her work, pulling a plow or a cart until she was physically unable to do so. The birth itself would often take place in a simple stable or even an open field, with little assistance and no veterinary supervision. The bond between the mare and her newborn foal was immediate and powerful, an ancient instinct that transcended the harsh realities of their existence. For a few short months, the foal would know the comfort of its mother's presence, the security of her protection, and the nourishment of her milk. This was a brief, golden period of relative freedom, a time of playful exploration and gentle learning under a watchful maternal eye. But this idyllic interlude was destined to be short-lived. The foal was not a creature to be nurtured for its own sake. It was a future asset, an investment that needed to be secured. The process of weaning, of separating the foal from its mother, was often abrupt and traumatic for both. The young horse, still a baby in all but name, would be thrust into a new world of discipline and control. The breaking process would begin, a systematic campaign to bend the foal's will to that of its human masters. It would learn to accept a halter, to be led, to have its feet handled. It would feel the weight of a saddle or the constraints of a harness for the first time. This was a terrifying and confusing experience for a young animal, a violent transition from the gentle world of its mother to the harsh realities of a life of service. The methods used were not always gentle. Fear and intimidation were common tools, the foal's natural exuberance and independent spirit seen as problems to be solved, obstacles to be overcome. The goal was to create an obedient, compliant animal, and the process was often a brutal breaking of the spirit. The future of the foal was already decided. It was destined for the army, the racetrack, the farm, or the road. It had no say in its own destiny. The brief, sweet memory of its mother's nuzzling would fade, replaced by the crack of the whip and the unyielding demands of its human owners. The mare, for her part, would be returned to the breeding cycle, her body used again and again to produce new generations of foals, each one destined for the same life of service, each one taken from her just as her heart had begun to bind them to them. Her silent grief, her repeated loss, was an unwritten and unacknowledged chapter in the story of Rome's greatness. Chapter 12. The Horse in Myth and Symbol. As you continue to drift, let your mind float away from the physical realities of the stable and the road and into the more ethereal realm of myth and symbol. For the Romans, the horse was not just an animal of flesh and blood. It was also a powerful idea, a potent symbol that galloped through their religion, their art, and their understanding of the world. In this symbolic realm, the horse was often elevated to a status of divine power and majesty, a stark and poignant contrast to the miserable existence of its real-world counterparts. In the grand tapestry of Roman mythology, horses were the companions of gods and heroes. The war god Mars, the divine father of the Roman people, was often depicted charging into battle in a chariot pulled by a pair of fiery, immortal steeds. The sun god Sol made his daily journey across the sky in a golden chariot drawn by 4 magnificent winged horses, their hooves striking sparks from the clouds. These were not the tired, sweating, beaten animals of the Roman roads. These were creatures of divine fire and untamable spirit, embodiments of the raw, untamed power of the natural world, a power that even the gods sought to harness. This elevated image of the horse was a constant presence in Roman public life. The equestrian statue, which we have touched on before, was more than just a portrait of a man on a horse. It was a complex piece of political propaganda. The horse, massive and powerful, yet perfectly controlled by its rider, was a symbol of the Roman state itself. It represented the wild, chaotic forces of the conquered world, the barbarian tribes, the untamed wilderness, all brought to heel by the calm, commanding authority of the emperor. The man controlled the beast, and Rome controlled the world. Every citizen who walked through the Forum and gazed up at the gleaming bronze figure of Marcus Aurelius on his steed would have understood this message implicitly. It was a story of power, of dominance, of the triumph of order over chaos. The horse was also a symbol of status and wealth among the living. To own a fine horse, let alone a team of perfectly matched chariot racers, was to make a public declaration of one's place in the social hierarchy. The clatter of hooves on stone, the sight of a gleaming carriage pulled by a pair of high-stepping steeds, these were the sounds and sights of power in the Roman city. On Roman coins, the image of the horse was used to commemorate military victories. The emperor often shown on horseback trampling his enemies underfoot. The horse was a stamp of authority, a mark of nobility, a constant visual reminder of who was in charge. And yet, this entire symbolic edifice, this grand cultural construct of the noble, powerful, divine horse, was built on a foundation of the suffering of millions of real animals. The Roman who admired the statue of the emperor on his majestic warhorse might moments later curse and whip his own exhausted, underfed cart horse. The citizen who cheered for the glorious steeds of the sun in a poem might not give a second thought to the broken, dying animals being dragged from the sands of the Circus Maximus. This was the great paradox of the Roman horse. In the world of ideas, it was a god. In the world of reality, it was a slave. The Romans could hold both of these contradictory views in their minds at the same time, without any apparent sense of conflict. They could celebrate the horse in their art and their religion, while simultaneously working it to death in their fields and on their roads. The symbolic horse was a beautiful, powerful lie, a comforting myth that masked a much uglier and more painful truth. And so, as you finally let go and sink into the quiet depths of sleep, remember this final, gentle irony, that the empire that so admired the image of the horse, that built its